Ah, yes, here we are once again. Now we're going to be talking about Lunsford Chapter 4, Appeals to Logos. So I will pull up the share screen in just a moment. Hope you're all doing well today. Professor King here. So let me just pull up this handy dandy share screen and we'll just dive right into it because why not? So... All right. So chapter 4 in Lunsford talks about arguments based on facts and reason, or appeals to logos. And according to Aristotle, there are two types of arguments. There are artistic proofs and there are inartistic proofs. And think about it this way. Art is made by somebody, right? It's created. That's really what is at the core of all art, right? It's something that is created deliberately. So the way that you can remember artistic proofs is that they are made by the writer, right? They're what we consider arguments and claims. Whereas inartistic proofs are what the writer is given, the research, the evidence, facts, data, statistics, etc. Right? So we're using these all the time in argument. These are just very old names for them provided to us by Aristotle, right? So when we talk about logos, right, we start with inartistic proofs, but again, logos contains both what we've created and what we've taken. And what we've taken is all the research, right? The facts, the data, the statistics, the quotes from experts that we'll talk about in a moment here. But logic is also that which we create, right? The critical thought, the step-by-step sort of understanding of a concept, the art of argument, in other words, right? The rhetoric. So the first thing we're looking at are facts. And facts, you know, when you're gathering facts, be skeptical, especially if you agree with what you're reading. You know, we've all kind of fallen prey to being that person who shares something on social media and then realized it was not from the most factual source. And that makes us lose credibility in the eyes of our peers, right? The academic setting isn't any different, except the stakes are higher. You know, people will forgive you on social media if you know, share a fake story about Florida man. But if you do that in a classroom setting with someone who, you know, has been doing this for a very long time, they're not going to be as kind to you, especially if it's a class about developing argument, right? So choose your facts wisely and always be skeptical of the information. Research the information that you're getting. Test the reliability of your facts because there is a lot of bad information out there. And guess where the #1 place where you can find bad information is, folks? Yes, that's right. It's Google. Google, you know, Google will lead you to some decent stuff, you know, government websites. Sorry, my brain's not working right now. It will lead you to things like NGOs, non-governmental organizations, but for the most part, it's a gigantic haystack of garbage because most of the stuff that you're finding on Google, even the way the Google search engine is set up, is so that people can get as many hits to their site as possible, right? And the reason why people want hits to their site is usually because they want a lot of people viewing their page, because that also means more money in their pocket. And money is money and the pursuit of scholarly knowledge a lot of time, almost always, don't go well together, right? If, in other words, if I'm sharing information with you in the hopes of getting money, that's not scholarly pursuit, that's marketing, right? So you want to make sure that you are avoiding that when you're doing scholarly research. If, you know, if you're trying to buy stuff, then that's fine. Google's great for trying to buy stuff. Most of us, when we go shopping online, that's what we do, right? We use Google to find our website. But in the scholarly academic setting, it's a horrible, horrible place to go. You should go to the library website instead. And we'll talk more about that in another video. So another form of logos that we can utilize, another inartistic proof would be statistics, right? We would take those from somebody else, unless you like actually, did a survey of hundreds of thousands of people randomly selected, with a double-blind procedure or something like. But I doubt most of us are doing that for our research. So we cull our statistics from somewhere else. But they can also be misused, right? Use them carefully and be mindful of how you interpret them. For example, in a later unit, we're going to talk about the prison industrial complex. And, people will say something like, well, there's actually technically, more white men in prison than there are black men. Yes, that's true, but that's because there are a lot more white men living in the United States than there are black men, right? So if we don't think about it in terms of numbers, but in terms of percentages, right, then we start to see how there can be some institutionalized racism within the prison system, right, within the justice system. And we're seeing that, all over the news media right now in summer of 2020. So that's one way that like statistics can be misused, right? In other words, just because the numbers say a certain thing, it's what you're doing with the numbers. And if you have a savvy audience who's reading your argument, and that savvy audience can pick apart what you're doing with those numbers, you have to be aware of that. You have to anticipate that when you're setting up your argument. So check and double check the statistics that you use. Another inartistic proof when we're talking about appeals to logos are surveys and polls, right? These provide persuasive reasons for actions or interventions, right? Because, when we're talking about research, when we're talking about data, right, big data, we don't want to use anecdotal evidence as much. We don't want to say, well, my grandfather told me X, Y, and Z, because that's one grandfather in a world of 7 billion people, right? So you want to use surveys and polls to show, right? Like, it's not just my one grandfather that told me this, but 100,000 people were polled on this particular question and they said this thing, right? But also, again, consider the source. Who's doing the polling? Is it a nonpartisan group, or is it a group that's trying to get a specific outcome, right? Like, in other words, if you have like a nonpartisan think tank that doesn't really have a stake in the political outcome of a poll, they are going to potentially provide a much different set of information than, say, like a Fox News, who has a political stake in the outcome that they want, right? So consider the source when you're looking at surveys and polls. But don't always discount the information that disagrees with you. Again, you want to be objective, and and this is so hard for people who argue. When they encounter information, particularly factual information, right, evidence that flies in the face of what they inherently believed, they'll ignore it, right? They'll pretend like it doesn't exist because it shakes up their whole paradigm, right? And we have to allow ourselves to be shaken up. We have to allow ourselves to be as objective and open-minded as we can, so that when information does shake up our previously held beliefs, we can go, instead of going, no, right? So keep that in mind, because you are going to encounter inevitably information that comes your way that you will say, well, I was always taught X, right? And this information says Y. And what, do you just ignore it? and say, nope, 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 XXX, right? Climate change is a great example, right? When we first started discussing climate change in the later half of the 20th century, there were so many people who said, okay, but this wasn't what I learned in Bible school, right? Or in my sort of religious upbringing. And so I'm not going to believe it. And the problem with that, right, is climate change doesn't go away. And if we ignore it and keep going about our business the same way, it's probably going to get worse, right? So that's why it's so important that we don't discount polls or surveys whose findings disagree with our previously held assumptions or beliefs or whatever. And don't use old data. The example I always use is like, if you're talking about, you know, the effects of divorce on children, you don't want to use data from the 1950s because it's going to sound much more negative and much less relevant than a discussion of divorce in 2020, right? So you want to use as current, up-to-date information when you're doing research as you possibly can. You know, the one sort of asterisk to that is if you are doing historical research, but for current issues, for current events, use the most up-to-date information that you can. Testimonies and narratives can give evidence and context, especially when the speaker providing that testimony or narrative has been considered to be trustworthy, right? But they shouldn't, here's what I'll say, they shouldn't be at the core of your argument. The statistics, the data, the stuff that's vetted, right? Not the personal story. Those should be at the forefront. The personal story should be sort of like the salt and pepper, the thing that adds a little context or flavor to all the solid research, the data-driven research that you do. So use it sparingly, right? Because if you just have a bunch of, again, think about the grandfather analogy I just used. If you just have a bunch of different, like, well, this person shared their story about this, and those other 3 people shared their stories. Again, those are 4 people in a world of 7 billion. So, you know, take them with a grain of salt. When we start to create our own logical arguments, now we're going into artistic proofs. We utilize these concepts. One is known as syllogism, the other one is known as enthymeme. Okay, so a syllogism, it's kind of like algebra. Like if you've ever taken an algebra class, I love and hate algebra. You know, algebra is great in that, hold on one sec. Okay. Algebra is great in that, like, you know, it's math and you can come up with a correct solution, but it really sucks in that it's boring, right? Like you have to go through every single step in an algebraic equation to show how you got to the solution you got. The writing equivalent to that is syllogism. It's a form of deductive reasoning where the conclusion follows logically and technically from the premises, okay? So in other words, like, you have to spell out every single step in the logical process. If you ever read philosophy, philosophers do this ad nauseum, and it drives people insane, right? Like, enthymeme is what we tend to do a little bit more often when we're speaking, and what we want to do when we're doing algebra, which is kind of cutting the corners that we say, like, well, yeah, but you know what I mean, right? So an enthymeme is a compressed argument. It contains a claim and a reason, but it depends on the audience's agreement with an assumption that's left implicit rather than spelled out, right? So the example you see on the right is, right, that all dogs are mammals, right? Pugs are mammals. If I just said pugs are mammals, we'd probably all go, yeah, of course, right? What's unspoken is that pugs are mammals because they're living creatures with vertebra that are dogs you know, and you can go on and on and on and on and on. But most of us know those things, so we don't want to sound redundant, or we don't want to sound too obvious. So we just say pugs are mammals, right? If I say something like, it's raining, so I'll be home later, right? If you know me, then you probably will understand that statement, right? But if you don't know me, then I would have to take that enthymeme, it's raining, so I'll be home later, and turn it into a syllogism, explain every step in the process. It's raining, so you know, the campus transportation that I normally use is not working on rainy days. So because of that, I will have to find alternative means of transportation. The alternative means of transportation that I will use will be a friend of mine, but my friend's class doesn't get out until an hour after mine. So I have to wait for that friend. And once that friend is done with her class, then she will let me be a passenger in her car and she will drive me home and I will be home late, right? That's a syllogism where you explain every single step in the logical process. I would say for your own writing, you want to use like a combination of both of them. You don't want to be so vague that your reader is going, what? I can't follow your logical line of reasoning, right? But you don't want to be so laborious and so tedious to where they're going, yes, I get it, right? So you really have, it's really a fine line to toe. You have to really think about what is the common sense of my audience, right? What is the shared knowledge between myself and my audience? And what are the things that I have to explain to them in order for this argument to make sense? When we're using logic, right, we still have to think about ethos and pathos. So we have to do things like avoid making assumptions, right? Again, draw out those inferences that to you might seem self-evident and supply credible evidence, right? So, you know, if I'll use the example from the prison industrial complex. If I say that, you know, a higher percentage of Black American men are in prison than white American men, right? Based on the number of people from those races that exist in this country, someone might say, well, that's racist, Professor King, right? Like, what are you getting at? In other words, are you trying to imply that Black men inherently are more criminal? Then I would have to say, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is there is a system that is set up to incarcerate Black men at higher rates than it does white men for the same exact offenses, right? I have to draw that out, because if I don't, right, then the assumption of some of my audience could be, ooh, Professor King is a racist, right? And we don't want our audience to be alienated, isolated, or turned off like that, right? We want to make sure that we're on the same page as them. So we have to maintain cultural sensitivity, right? And we have to do that in a number of ways. So keep that in mind. And finally, think about the logical structures that you're using. The first one is so important. Talking about degree, the degree to which something occurs or exists or is important. Try to avoid using broad brush statements like all or none or everybody or nobody, because again, rarely, other than, you know, breathing oxygen, rarely does everybody think, feel, or do the exact same thing. So use degree, right? People in these groups to this extent in these situations do X or feel X or believe X, okay? For artistic logical proofs, you can utilize analogies. I do this all the time. If you've watched any of my videos so far, you'll see that I make constant comparisons to try and explain complex ideas. So we do it all the time, right? Like if you look at the quote from John Oliver on the right, you know, that he's using an analogy. He says, you don't need people's opinions on a fact. You might as well, that's where the analogy comes in. That's where the comparison comes in. You might as well have a poll asking which number is bigger, 15 or 5? Do owls exist? Are there hats, right? What he's saying is, right, like, a fact is a fact. It doesn't, again, it doesn't matter how people feel about it. And it would be to fret over how people feel about a fact is just as ridiculous as asking if owls exist, right? That's the analogy. That's what he's getting at. So they're very useful. I love them. They're very useful in, again, explaining something that is very unfamiliar or foreign to an audience in a way that they understand. And then finally, we have precedent, and precedent compares the rhetorical situation, or at least an aspect of it, to something that came before or is already in place, right? If or then statements. Okay. So if, if this, then that, right? You're setting up a precedence. You're setting up a precedent, right? So you're saying essentially like, if I step on your foot, then you will probably cry, right? If I do not step on your foot, then you will probably not cry, right? So it shows logical reasoning in that you're thinking about the future, right? You're thinking about the hypothetical and what could potentially happen. And this is important, especially when we're talking about how things should be, or what we think, what policy we think should be enacted, or what arguments we think should be believed, because we can go any number of ways with arguments, right? And so if we go X way, then that will happen. If we go Y way, then that will happen. If we go Z way, then that will happen, right? And that's where your logic comes in, because you're anticipating, based on the research you've done, what potentially could happen. So I'll take it off the stop share screen. So that is chapter 4. That's logic. Again, that is the most important of the 3 appeals that you'll be using in your argument essays. So it's important that you know these concepts, that you employ them in your writing, that you work them, so that you can become a better critical thinker. So I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you in cyberspace. Bye-bye.